As we look at Ruth chapter 2, there's a couple of things in play here that are important for us to note or notice. In that we see that there's a system in place here in the Old Testament, which is a system that doesn't necessarily fit in today's system, but it is something in which the Israelites were guided into. It was something in which the Israelites were given as part of their law, a part of their expectation, for what we would consider to be the modern term of social justice. And we need to understand this in the fact that the church, throughout all of its history, has been an agent of social justice. The church has always been an agent in which looks after the least of any community for the purpose of bringing them into a survivable state, into a state in which they are comforted, and a state in which they have what they need, a state in which they are lifted up and they are brought into a place of respect and worthy community. And what we see here is the church has always been a part of this system. And the church has done this throughout history. We've done this in different ways. And in fact, most all current issues or current expressions of what we refer to as institutionalized social justice actually begin with the church. I mean, just if we look at the country of England and we look at what the individuals did in England, we look at the fact that the modern school system, the fact that children aren't working in factories and working on the street, and the fact that they're educated and we have a system in which there's an institutionalized education system, happened as a result of the church in England. The fact that we have hospitals, places in which we can go and find health care, and there are service industries in which individuals who don't even have insurance can go and be a part of that, is a result of churches in England doing these things. There are institutions that happen here in America for those who are unhoused and those who are downtrodden, those who may be abused or assaulted, or individuals who are part of addiction or part of families where they can't find belonging or whatever, in which the church has always picked up and has always meant to be the institution of peace for those who are experiencing disruption. And God has set this up not as an act of charity, but as an act in which he is establishing a system in which every single individual that is part of his people are able to find what they need to survive. And we see this all throughout the Levitical law. The Levitical law even had expressions if you were an individual who maybe had found themselves in debt to somebody. And maybe you had taken on debt with a landowner or whatever it might be. There were even laws to protect those who were in debt. I mean, the book of Leviticus outlines exactly what you can take if you are owed a debt and what you can't take if you're owed a debt. In fact, it's so specific that it says you are not even allowed to take the person's cook pot, their plate, or their spoon. Because everybody needs to be able to cook and eat. So if you are owing somebody money, that person can never ask to have the utensils in which it would take for you to survive. They have things like you can't take the clothes off of somebody's back. You can't take advantage of and you can't disrupt individuals and give them a space in which they can't survive. But one of the things they had in the Old Testament was a series of what we refer to as gleaning laws. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this expression before. I think some of you probably have. We use it in the idea of I gleaned knowledge for somebody, or I gleaned this thing. And gleaning literally means to be found. And the gleaning laws are laws in which were established in Leviticus chapter 25, in which we are supposed to, as Israelites, create a space in which those who are impoverished, those who are disenfranchised, those who have no family, particularly the unhoused, the widows, and the orphans, there's supposed to be, in every single field, boundaries set up so that those individuals can always make sure that they can find at least that day's meal. And these gleaning laws are taken into effect that we see even travelers. If you were traveling through an area and you were walking by a field, even you could go along the field and you could glean off of the field to make sure that you have enough food for that day. And there are three specific outlines that they give us in the book of Leviticus to let landowners know exactly what it means to be an individual and to leave this space for individuals to have what they need. And these gleaning laws express themselves in three major ways. And what happened was, if you were a landowner back in the day, and I don't know if anybody here has ever been a farmer. Do we have any farmers? All right, so Sharon's been a farmer. Anybody else been like a farmer? All right, now one thing I know about farmers, if you watch farmers today, farmers, man, they want everything. You got to get every last little drop off of it. The only real place I notice gleaning anymore, it's not free anymore, but I lived in Virginia for quite a while. Has anybody ever gone to an apple orchard? Okay. At an apple orchard, you got two options here. You can walk up to the counter and say, I'd like a bushel of apple. The only place, I don't even know what a bushel is, but I know you can get apples full of them. But you can get yourself a bushel of apples. All right, you can buy it right there. And they come out with like a little basket and they give it to you and all those different things. And it's like, I don't know, they say, okay, like $20 for a bushel of apples, whatever it is. Or, and this is a racket, I'll tell you what. They say, or for $20, you can go pick your own bushel of apples. Now, here's the reason this is a scam, okay? Now, if you're an apple farmer, I'm not sorry. Just be better. I don't know. But you can go pick a bushel of apple. But what it is it's basically all the apples that the workers decided, we don't need to pick this. So they left it on the tree. And you can pay today to go glean in the orchard. And gleaning was this. It was the perimeter of the field. Anything that wasn't picked up by those harvesting, or anything that fell out of the basket as they were collecting it. So it was a space. It was created for the purpose of helping individuals be able to find food and find quality and be part of the community. It was designed for that. But also at the same time, it wasn't necessarily the best of the best crop. Right? So what happened is those who farmed wouldn't touch the edges of the field. There was a margin, we refer to as the margin. They wouldn't pick up anything that had fallen on the ground, and if the thing wasn't quite ripe or the thing wasn't quite worth taking down, they would leave it on the stalk, on the branch, or whatever. So individuals then would come along after the harvest, and they would glean the field. So what we see here is in this book, Ruth, who's a Moabite, is able and fully allowed, even as a foreigner, to go glean in the field. It's 100% something that she could have done. And every single widow in the community or foreigner or traveler could have been there as well. So if that's the case, you got to understand that when you're gleaning, you are not able to glean much. You might be able to get enough food for the day, but you're not really going to be able to make a living out of this gleaning because everyone who is disenfranchised also is gleaning from the field. So what they would do is people would go, they would harvest, and then these gleaners would come in after they had finished that row. Kind of just follow behind them at a good distance and let them get their stuff, and they would go after them. And if there are multiple people in this field, you can understand why at one point Ruth actually says that she's worried for, or why Naomi says she's worried for Ruth, because she says, I don't want you to go to some field and get assaulted. Because if you're sitting there and there are people who are struggling to eat and there's 20 people all trying to glean the same food, you can see how this might get a little bit rough and a little bit dangerous. But she finds herself gleaning in a field. And she comes across a guy named Boaz. This is important for us because Boaz, as an Israelite, had to allow for the disenfranchised to participate in gleaning of his field. But remember, gleaning is for the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the traveler, not somebody that's connected to your household. Right? It is just the leftovers. Like, hey, take what you can get, you'll be fine. So Ruth finds herself gleaning in the field of Boaz. Now Boaz sees that there's one person named Ruth. Now we don't know, we can put some conjecture in here, whatever it might be. We know that Boaz is an unmarried man. We know that Boaz is a wealthy landowner. We know that he's got this field, and we know that Boaz has left room for people to glean because he's got gleaners in his field. And I don't know if they just happened to see that there's one gleaner that's working harder than everybody else. Some pastors have said that he just sees a gleaner out in the field and he goes, "Hey, how you doing?" But in any case, he sees Ruth in the field, but he is actually touched by the fact that he says, "Who's that person?" And they say a couple of things. They give him some information. They say, "That's Ruth. Don't you know she's the daughter-in-law of Naomi, whose husband died? And she has been out on the field since our harvesters have been out there, and she's only taken one break." All right. So Ruth is out there hustling. All right. She's working. She is like trying to take advantage of the situation. She's not letting other people, like she's out there. She's working hard, doing all those different things. And this is going to catch Boaz's eye. And as this catches Boaz's eye, he finds out who this person is, and then he does something in which the law does not require of him. He does something in which he has no expectation to do, and he has no like past experience in which he should be a part of, which is he goes out into the field and he begins to walk with Ruth and he begins to ask her some questions. And as he's talking with Ruth, he does something which is astonishing. And we're going to look at why Boaz doesn't have to do this. We're going to see this next week. But Boaz goes up to Ruth and he says something. And he says, "Ruth, I've seen what you're doing. I don't want you to go to another field. I'm going to make sure that you're not hassled. I'm going to make sure that my people who are working know that you're under my protection, that I want you to glean in this field." And he does something else. He says, "And I don't want you to be a gleaner anymore." Now, it doesn't say that in the text. We don't necessarily see him say, "You're no longer a gleaner." But there's a major transition that's happening here where he takes Ruth from gleaning from the edge of the field, picking up the leftovers or what's fallen on the ground, and he says, "Ruth, don't leave this field. Instead, I want you to walk with my young women." My young women. So what would happen is the young men would come do the heavy lifting. They are the first round of harvesters. And then the young women would come up after that, and they would get all of the low-hanging fruit. You ever heard the term low-hanging fruit before? It's because it's easy to pick up. So the women would come by and they get all the low-hanging fruit. And Boaz says to Ruth, "I want you to walk amongst my women." This is a huge transition that's happening here because Ruth has gone from foreigner to family, exile to household. She has moved from the individual who has to take the leftovers to where now she's able to get low-hanging fruit. And Boaz transitions this into a place in which Ruth is able to move from scraping by, barely getting enough for the day, having to work without a break so that she has enough for her and her mother, to now she is able to walk alongside those who are harvesting. And he says, now Ruth is no longer a foreigner, she's one of us. And he brings her into a community in which she is able to walk alongside the young women. And he says, when you need to take a break with all the other young women, take a break and you don't have to worry about being thirsty. We'll pull up water for you. Right? Now, today, it's not a big issue. If you want to get a glass of water, it is as difficult as... But back in the day, even if some of you were on I don't know if anybody's ever been on a well where you had to manually pump the water. Even that was easy. You just kind of prime the pump and the water comes up, all those different things. I mean, we're talking about back in this day, these are people who had to lower a bucket and pull up water. Right? Getting water was more probably labor intensive than gleaning the field. And he says, not only do I want you to walk with my ladies, I want you to be part of what's happening here, but also we'll pull water for you. We'll make sure that you have a break. He feeds her lunch. He says, hey, why don't you sit down and why don't, we've got a little picnic here for my workers. Why don't you have a picnic? He puts her leftovers in a little doggy bag for her, gives her some wine and some bread to take home for dinner. He sets her, he's done everything for her. And he sets up this situation. And then behind Ruth's back, he goes to his male workers. Now remember, the male workers are doing the majority of the harvesting. They're the ones getting the big bushes and bundles together. Then the ladies are going to get the low-hanging fruit, and then you have the gleaners come by after that. And he goes to his young men and he says, hey, can you bushel up get bound together some of this stuff, and can you leave it on the floor and give it to Ruth? So not only has Ruth gone from gleaning the field to working with the household, now he's actually got his household putting together bundles and harvesting for Ruth. And at the end of the day, Ruth takes all that she has and she goes to the mill and she pounds all of her wheat and barley out, and it says that she has 1 ephah full of wheat and barley. Now, if you are like me, you look at that and you go, cool. What an ephah. I love that that's an ephah. But it says that an ephah was about 2/3 a bushel, which, when it says beatens out, is about 22 liters of flour. I don't know if you're a baker, you can make a lot of bread with 22 liters of flour. So she comes out not with barely a day's worth of food. She comes out with food enough for her, food enough for her mother, food enough to save, and even food enough to sell if she needs to. She went from gleaning the field to now being prosperous in the field as well. And Naomi goes to Boaz at the end, or Ruth goes to Boaz at the end of the day, and she says, why have I found such favor in your eyes? Why have I found favor in your eyes? And Boaz says to her something where he says, in verse 11, Boaz answers her and says, why do you have favor? Everything that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. I know that you left your father and mother, you left your people, and you have given yourself to my God. Ruth's favor is not external. It wasn't her work ethic and showing up to the field. It wasn't the fact that Boaz thought she was pretty. It wasn't the fact that Boaz was just unmarried and he saw a potential spouse. It wasn't any of those things. Boaz looks at Ruth, and as soon as he hears the name, he knows this is the woman who left her gods to follow the God of Israel. This is the woman who left her family to take care of my mother-in-law. This is the woman who could have left when Naomi released her, but she didn't. This is the individual that not only stayed with Naomi, but also showed up first thing in the morning and began working. This is the person who has dedicated themselves to leave her people to become one of God's people, who left her gods to follow our God, who left her family to be part of my family. And he looks at her and says, you have found favor because of what you have done in honoring God and honoring your mother-in-law and honoring what we do here. And just like we said last week, and just like we said the week before, and just like we said, we looked through the book of Peter, it was the testimony of Ruth that had the power to change her world. We've been talking about this for weeks and weeks and weeks. Your testimony is the power in which changes the world. It's what God has done for you, what God is doing for you. And I'll ask you again, if God has done something for you and you want to share that, right after service, I want you to go over by the information booth. You'll see some lights and stuff set up there. I want you to record your testimony and just share what God has done for you. We'll put a little microphone on you. Give me 2 minutes to say, this is what God has done in my life and how he's impacted me. Because Ruth finds favor based upon her testimony. When she reports to Naomi everything that happened, Naomi goes, Who found favor? Like, who gave you favor? She said, oh, some guy named Boaz. And Naomi goes, like, Boaz? She's like, yeah. She goes, don't you know that Boaz is one of our redeemers? Remember I told you last week that back in the day, if you were to become a widow, you were supposed to take the next oldest brother of the man you were married to, and he was supposed to wed you. He was supposed to take your kids. You were like, but remember, Naomi didn't have any more sons. She tells Ruth, like, if you come with me, I don't have any offspring to give you. I have no prospects for you. However, in Israelite law, like I mentioned, Israelite law does create more space than other ancient communities. And Israelite law also had what we refer to as an extended redeemer system, in which the kinsman redeemer in Deuteronomy chapter 25 lists out and goes through the process of outlining exactly who can and who should redeem an individual who has found themselves to be widowed. And it usually starts off with the closest relative, so brother, so on and so forth. However, after that, there was still the redeeming laws for the kinsman redeemer that went into the extended family as well. And next week, we're actually going to look at this, because what we're going to see here is when Naomi says that Boaz is one of the redeemers, what I want us to understand here, and what we're going to see next week is Boaz is not actually the primary redeemer. He's not next in line. Right? There's actually another guy that's next in line, but what happens is if all of the brothers are deceased and you're a widow, it then passes on to uncles, cousins, and extended family and everything like that. And Boaz is in the line of individuals that Ruth can legally marry. This is important for us because we're going to see that there's still the hope in which Naomi has and Ruth has to experience what we refer to as redemption. Redemption is salvation. It's reconciliation. It's being brought back into fullness. And Naomi says, stay as close as you can to Boaz. Because Boaz is somebody who could redeem us. And what we're going to see here as we look next week, and as we look at week 4, chapter 4, that Boaz is going to be our image and our illustration of the person of Jesus. And we can already see what's happening here. If we look at and we draw the comparison between Boaz and Jesus, and we look at the comparison of Ruth to you have to know and understand that just like Ruth was a foreigner who was brought into a family. Ruth was a gleaner who was brought into prosperity. Ruth was a gleaner who was brought into a community. You used to be a foreigner brought into God's family. You used to be in destitution, in which God brought you into abundance. You used to be somebody who was seeking the scraps, but God has given over and has given you in abundance. That Jesus Christ changes and brings you into and out of foreigner into the kingdom. He brings you out of the exile and into inclusivity. And we're going to see here that Boaz begins the redemption and reconciliation process with Ruth in chapter 2. And he's going to continue on as we move through the book of Ruth, getting her into a fully encompassed and fully enthroned individual in the family and the community of God. We'll also see that this wasn't the first time Boaz has been a part of this. In fact, Boaz is also going to be a product of Redeemer and reconciliation. Because his mother also not an Israelite who was brought into the kingdom. This isn't something that was completely foreign. This is something which Boaz had. And this is important for us because after you move from foreigner into the kingdom, there's an expectation in which you then help other individuals into that kingdom as well. And I don't know where you are today. Maybe you've never entered into the kingdom. Maybe you've never had a relationship with Jesus Christ, and you need to begin a relationship with Jesus Christ today. And you say, you know what? I'm still surviving on scraps. Jesus wants to invite you into the family today. Maybe you've been saved for a while. And you need to do something that's going to help other individuals come into faith in Jesus Christ. Maybe you need to share your story. God wants to utilize you this week. Maybe you don't want to share your story for us to post online. That's fine. Maybe you need to go tell your story to your neighbor. Maybe you need to go sit down with that friend of yours and tell them what God has done for you so that you can be a Boaz in somebody else's life. So this morning, our choir is going to sing. As our choir sings, they're going to take some time here in which we will have an opportunity to reflect on what God is doing. They're going to sing about the power of God, and if God is truly behind us, what do we have to fear? Why would we have any hesitation? And as they sing, I want you to think about what God is calling you to do. Is God calling you into a relationship today? If he is, as soon as you leave here today, come talk to me at the door. We'll find a place for you to learn about Jesus. If God is calling you to share your testimony today, go over, share your testimony. If I'm not there, just hit record on my phone. I'll edit it together. You'll be fine. All right? But don't let today go by without dealing with whatever Jesus has you deal with. Amen?